But
Yeah.
Stephen, I mean, I want to talk about a lot of other things here, but let's talk about this piece you put out yesterday called "A Couple of Charts to Explain a Harris Loss," and I have them handy here if you want me to bring them up. So just let me know and I can bring them up. But tell me about what these two charts were, what they represented, and why you think that they were so damning for the Harris campaign.
So the charts show just a massive increase in poverty and food insecurity since 2021. Um, and I highlight 2021 through 2023, which is, I mean, these two big reports came out from the Census Bureau and the USDA in September. Um, and I highlighted 21 through 23 just to show that there's been a lot of economic pain going
Mm.
on. And when I say economic, I'm not talking jobs reports. I'm not talking about the stock market. I'm talking about cost of living. I'm talking about personal finances. I'm talking about the livability of everyday life. So while there's been real pain going on, the Biden-Harris administration has effectively been gloating about jobs numbers, the stock market, GDP, which is, if it's not directly offensive to people, it just seems a little bit off base, and that's not the information that people want to hear. They want to hear more helpful information of how to deal with their situation. If not poverty, there's even more people, unable to afford household items in the last 7 days. And then even more people, 2/3 of people live paycheck to paycheck. So there's just been this vibe going on for probably the last 2.5 years where we've seen an amazing national economic recovery. Like it truly, like they've earned some bragging rights because it's been super impressive. Every macroeconomic indicator I can think of ranges from pretty good to like historically good. But at the same time, it's the context doesn't really allow you to brag about it too much because you have all this very real hardship
Mm.
going on the human security level. It's like this. It's like it conveys sort of a sense of arrogance as if like akin to like if I walked into a library and thought to myself, all these women must be too shy to ask for my number. I guess I'll just start yelling it. It's just like even if they were nominally interested in that information, hopefully one of them or more would be. They probably wouldn't be after I started just yelling my area code out in the middle of,
Mhm.
whatever part of the Dewey Decimal System I was in. So that was basically the um the point of the piece. And as I said at the beginning of it, like I made a whole bunch of charts
Mhm.
in preparation for a Harris loss. And I never really looked at polls. I mean, I glanced at them here and there, but like the reason why I thought Harris would lose is because I saw for the last 120 has been voters' number one concern, not even close. Like over twice as much as abortion, and over twice as much as immigration, which are hugely salient topics. And I just saw the Trump people talking a lot about cost of living. Of course, no plan to improve it.
Mhm.
But again, the kind of arrogance, tone deafness coming from the Democratic Party just spelled bad news.
I mean, it was really bizarre, right? I mean, that the economic argument that we were getting from a lot of Harris like surrogates and people in the media was saying, yeah, everything is super great in the U.S. economy. And as you're saying, it's like, yeah, there are a lot of indicators that like you can make that argument to your friends in DC, maybe, but to folks who are really living it, it falls a little flat. And maybe to help us get into this a little bit, and I hope it's legible for folks. I'm sorry if not. There's a link below for everyone to read the piece in more in depth. I mean, could you talk us through this, Stephen? This first one here, poverty in the United States, and its increases and what that experience has been since 2021.
So there's basically three levels to financial hardship. The one is paycheck to paycheck living, where you have the bar that moves here and there, fluctuates, but it usually stays between like 55 and 60%. In September it was at 66% though, and and then there's the group of there's a subset of that group, like 40% of the population, who through the household pulse survey, the Census Bureau has been asking this question since early 2020. Have you had trouble affording basic household goods. And then poverty is the most serious level. And I understand there's like different levels of poverty, but those are basically the three levels of financial hardship. And all of them show this pretty much this exact trend. It shows a sharp reduction in 2021 with the passage of the American Rescue Plan. And then in 2022, it shows not just an increase, but a historic increase. And you can look at child poverty too. It looks the exact same as this graph. Basically, obviously different numbers, but the tragedy is Democrats had the formula. They had the chance, like even with inflation, had they made permanent those temporary welfare positions in the American Rescue Plan, which is what they campaigned on. That's what Build Back Better was. The purpose of it was to make permanent, to capitalize on an emergency and make permanent a kind of diet European welfare state we had going on. Dope. But they reneged. And I think we can get into this later, but I think it was just a lack of political effort. And as a result, it doesn't really matter which human security variable you look at, they all get worse since 2021. And even if you break it,
I mean, this is damning.
Year.
Yeah, keep
it's
going. But
horrible.
this is extreme for people who are. Some people will be listening to. 2019, 38.3 million. 2020, 30 million, 2021, 25.6 million. And then we see a massive, massive jump to 40.9 million. And by 2023, 42.8 million people living in poverty in the United States.
I'll just say, what are Democrats saying? Look at the unemployment numbers. We got your ass back to work, which like when Trump was saying that, when Trump says it about black people, people understand it as like a sort of patriarchal, like entitlement to labor or like labor coercion. And Democrats basically touted the unemployment the exact same way this entire time.
The haunting part is I'm working on a piece now, Matt, that's funny you bring it up, because basically in early 2022, this was, basically a couple months out, or just like a few weeks after Biden gave up on Build Back Better, he was talking about deficit reduction. There's a huge pivot, like the whole narrative around his budget request for the next year in fiscal 2023 was about deficit reduction. None of the stuff was specific, none of the BBB stuff, the child tax credit, those sorts of things, the housing, the medication, et cetera, was included in that specifically. So one of the reasons he gave for that, and like he started Biden basically started bragging about reducing the deficit around this time. And one of the ways that he mentioned him doing that is ending pandemic relief programs. And his very excuses, I'm finally getting to the point here, his excuse was, we've put Americans back to work. They don't need it anymore. But he campaigned on making those provisions permanent. So if coupled, with that huge that national economic recovery with jobs, et cetera, if they had enacted BBB, inflation still would have mattered, but people would have been able to deal with it. But instead, people had to deal with inflation as critical programs were expiring and being taken away. So that's why you see this specific pattern in the chart, like the jump from 21 to 22, and then again, the 22 to 23 just reflects an unwinding of a deterioration of that, as I said, that diet European welfare state we had.
Well, just really quick, Matt, before I just want to bring up this other chart because it tells a similar story, and I just think let's bring them both in here because this is again Trump. We could talk about Trump and what he represents in a minute, but one thing he was talking about was like not just cost of living, but like specifically food, right? And like he talks about it like a weird guy and a rich guy and out of touch guy. But when you look at this, I mean, there's literally an experience of hunger that is dramatically increasing in this country in this period.
Right. Yeah. And, the reason, ultimately, the reason why I chose those two graphs isn't just because I had them ready and I've been kind of sitting on them, but they're the first two dimensions of the human security paradigm, which I don't know if it's like big in the human. Yeah. So in 1994, there was this development report from the UN that sought to redefine what security meant. We had a lot of this discussion in 2022, where it's like we had this huge military budget, but we were radically unprepared for a pandemic. So it's like, okay, so what does security actually mean? Are we thinking about it in terms of we're obsessed with national security, this concept of the state, but we should be focusing on security at the human level primarily. Now, I embrace that view. I take a little bit more nuance. So like my working theory and what I try to do is, I think policies should be designed foremost to improve the security of the working class, because you bypass the national security bullshit. That stuff still matters, but you automatically include, you predispose international solidarity. And besides, workers make the economy go, so we should think about them first. So, and again, you brought up Mike Davis earlier, like the earth belongs to labor. Like, I'm pretty sure that was his quote, and like I fully subscribe to that. But anyway, I mean, the first two dimensions of this human security paradigm are economic security and food security. And economic security does include employment opportunities, so that's part of the equation. And Biden definitely recovered it because employment's at very low, like 3 or 4% or whatever. But at the same time, it also includes access to a social welfare net, and it also includes the ability to afford the necessary household items. And food insecurity, same deal. Yeah,
I'm just going to read these out, Stephen. No, keep going.
Yeah.
I just want to read these out for the listeners. So this chart is that U.S. food insecurity increased 40% since 2021. In 2019, 35.2 million people were experiencing food insecurity. 2020, it jumps up to 38.3 million. In 2021, it drops. And this is, I think, a really important part about these charts too, Stephen, right? Is that people not only is the increase, but the fact that people also experience the drop, right? Which means, people experiencing this as a recent experience in their life. That goes up in 2022. Sorry, I know this is tough with a lot of numbers for listeners, but in 2022, it goes from 33.8 million in 2021 to 44.2 million in 2022. And by 2023, 47.4 million people in the United States of America experiencing food insecurity.
I mean, a simple way to say it is also the child poverty rate doubled after those programs elapsed. And it's wild to me. Like, we had this, I have a huge thread where I have like a few quote tweets of Stephen in there, but my tweet was like 2 years ago, which is like, if you're saying the economy's good, compared to the G7 or whatever, which, like, as you say, Steve, we're not blind to those metrics, but you have to look at like what this means for like rent prices or these sorts of things. And it's like, it's been absolutely dire, and it was before COVID. So returning to some sort of pre-COVID normal, and also like the patent on the back for the wage increases, everything's inflated. So like, if wages would have been the one thing that weren't inflated, I think that would have been even more of a shock. But yeah, sorry, I kind of ranted.
No, and one of the things is, like, if you do your own shopping, which I'm pretty sure all of us do,
Yeah.
like, you go to the grocery store, it feels like, I mean, every time you go to the grocery store, it kicks you in the head and takes your wallet. That's at least how I feel.
Yeah.
So I did make a chart of this like a couple months ago. It was after Biden's debate performance, and like Jake Tapper's first question to him, this was like the catastrophe debate, where it was just a total abomination. But it was odd though. Like, Biden was horrible the whole night, but he was at least somewhat able to talk about NATO, which is truly like his breadbasket and what he cares about. But the very first question Jake Tapper asked about food prices, but I think that was the one where Biden ended it with saying, "We finally beat Medicare." It was just like non-existent. And meanwhile,
and then Trump's like, "Yeah, you beat it to death."
Yeah. Trump was feeling so smug with himself because he's finally doing well in debate. But food prices have increased. Household food costs have increased 35% since 2020, which is just massive. Food insecurity is at its highest level since 2014. These are all charts that I've made or in the past or haven't published. But you just see a decline in these everyday metrics where it's tangible and it's painful. It's like if the GDP loses 100 billion tomorrow, it's like, we don't feel that. That's just, something that happens. Like, fluctuations in GDP are just something that goes on when you're, at the pub or on a podcast or reading a book. You don't necessarily feel it, but you do feel it, like, tangibly.
Well, this is why, I mean, one of the arguments that we were getting from pundits and writers and even from the campaign to a certain extent was like, oh, well, Biden and then Kamala sort of suffering from like the bad vibes economy, right? And like the idea was that like this is just like, oh, people have bad vibes about it and like and whatever. And it's like, these graphs, and these aren't the only ones out there, right? That sort of are showing this experience of struggling that a lot of Americans are having. That's not a vibe. right? That is literally like, I'm worried about being able to put food on the table for my family.
Yeah, this is how you measure, you know, those human security variables I mentioned. That's how you measure, you know, human conditions in disaster zones.
Hmm.
So on one hand, I've done a lot of work on the humanitarian response and to Gaza, and I've done a lot of work on Gaza. Recently, I there's this big report from Brown University on the total cost of U.S. military aid and military support for Israel. I co-authored that report with Linda Bilmes, who's brilliant from Harvard, and then Bill Hartung, like who does great work as well at Quincy Institute. But I bring that up, one, to, you know, gain credibility with the audience, so they just don't think I'm an idiot, but because I've already talked about yelling my number in the library. But I bring it up because I'm looking at human security variables in Gaza, and I'm looking at it in the US, and I'm seeing just both. I'm seeing deliberate starvation in Gaza, and I'm seeing increasing food insecurity for no fucking reason in the US, where there's no, you know, Israel isn't killing, you know, grocers and bombing people on their way to the grocery store. So it was just an unambitious domestic policy put forth by Harris that didn't address any of this stuff, along with, you know, a pro-genocide foreign policy that just zapped the movement from all the energy. Like in Pennsylvania, there's a lot of Harris people around. Credit to them for door knocking, but they had the energy of people asking you to get a flu shot. Like the energy just wasn't there. So
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can pull that out. And I'd actually like to expand and talk about that a little bit more in depth in a moment. But just on these charts and this argument about like that this wasn't a fucking vibe. This was like an actual experience. I mean, it really drives me crazy. I mean, one thing, you know, for people who've been listening to Left Reckoning for years, that we really go ahead, Matt.
Child poverty doubled. That's not vibes. And the only people that could convince themselves of vibes is people that have no connection, like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon connection from people that experience actual poverty.
Yeah.
And that's the entire media. Like none of them experience poverty. It's why, like it is.
But what's exhausting about it, Matt, is like, one, they don't get it, right? But what makes me really angry about it is this fucking canard that gets trotted out every year. It's like, quote unquote, like people voting against their interests or not knowing their interests. And like, I'm not saying that the right is like offering a solution to any of this kind of thing, but to act here like when somebody says, "Oh, I'm mad about the Biden economy," right? That they're not like acting in their interest of saying "fuck you" to those people is just wrong. You're missing the fact that you know, this very real thing. And I want to ask you, Stephen, like on this point, right, on this vibes economy thing, one of the narratives that I think is going to become the narrative, right, from smart people we like might like and respect, is that inflation is a killer in politics, and the Biden administration just got a hard hand, right? Because a lot of governments struggled in the elections with the inflation. Could you speak a little bit about how maybe the Biden administration could have avoided this? I mean, you've talked about this a little bit, but like, you know, what is it like materially that they could have done? It wasn't just like, oh, God gave them a bad fucking hand. They made massive mistakes here that increased these problems that we're talking about, right?
yeah, I mean, taking like greedflation took way too long to catch on as a serious concept. Even though it's like, you know, I understand stuff happens in the supply chain. It was a global pandemic. Of course, things are happening in the supply chain, but it's pretty easy to tell when price gouging is going on. And Harris came out with that proposal. Like that was part of like an anti-price gouging provision in her economic proposal, but it was 4 years too late. And it wouldn't address anything now. But anyway, the government basically had two approaches to inflation relief. For the people, it decided that its primary response was going to be reducing the deficit, aka austerity.
Yeah.
And of course, Biden cut spending, but it didn't improve inflation. You know, it didn't. You know, so he was automatically approved wrong with that. But the other approach to inflation was with respect to the Pentagon. So Trump increased the military budget massively during his time in office. I think 20% in real terms from Obama's last budget to Trump's final budget. I think Biden's over 30% now. I know the budget for this past year was $953 billion, which is more than the U.S. spent on its military in 1943. So that gives you a clue into two very different approaches to inflation. So for the people, austerity, but for the Pentagon, oh, the price has gone up on the stuff you buy. Oh, here's more money. Even though the Pentagon sort of it sets all the prices. It's a state-run, centralized economy. It's kind of cool in that respect, especially with the healthcare provision. So a lot of leftist veterans I know always talk about, like,
I mean, what's it, Friedrich
expanding
James?
the VA.
Yeah, you know, Friedrich James. We were talking about this recently. Friedrich Jameson's like expand the military. Anyway, we could get lost on that one, but
Yeah. I'm already getting sidetracked anyway, but essentially going after price gouging. I don't know exactly how that would work in terms of the corporate thing, but
I'm sorry. Their plans on the grocery stuff was pretty half baked. I'm sorry. Like,
okay, yeah,
it was nice that like they were thinking about maybe addressing it to a certain extent. But it wasn't as material, and the voters rejected it. So
They said it once and ran away from it, and it seemed like the kind of thing. It's like, okay, this is what we give AOC to, like, you know, get the endorsement or something. Like,